Denmark just shattered everything we thought we knew about European politics. A left-wing government is leading the continent's most brutal immigration crackdown. They're forcing relocations, building offshore prisons, and doubling jail sentences in immigrant neighbourhoods. This isn't some far-right fantasy. Parliament voted 70 to 24 in favour. The same party that once championed open borders now has a plan to eliminate what they call ghettos by 2030.
So we have to change this. We need some new solutions. We have to lower the influx of migrants to Europe.
Something strange is driving this complete reversal, and the implications are terrifying. Let that sink in for a moment. This is Denmark we're talking about. The country that gave us progressive taxation, universal healthcare, and the happiest people on earth. A nation that welcomed refugees with open arms for decades, proud of its humanitarian values and multicultural tolerance. But something fundamental shifted. In 2010, Danish authorities created their first official list. They called certain neighborhoods ghettos, not slums or poor areas, ghettos.
The fact that my home country, Denmark, has passed such a discriminatory law against citizens like me is both shameful and disappointing.
Areas where more than 50% of residents came from non-Western countries and failed government benchmarks for crime, education, or employment. The term wasn't chosen by accident, it carried weight. It suggested these weren't just struggling communities, but parallel societies that threatened the very fabric of Danish life. By 2018, Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen stood before her nation and declared these areas a direct threat to social cohesion and the welfare state itself. This wasn't inflammatory rhetoric from the far right. This was the leader of the Social Democrats, the party of workers' rights and social justice, essentially declaring war on parts of her own country. The plan they unveiled had a chilling simplicity: Denmark without parallel societies by 2030. Complete elimination, no exceptions. But to understand how Denmark's left-wing government became Europe's immigration hardliners, you first need to see exactly what they saw in their own neighborhoods. The data that made them abandon decades of liberal ideology. The numbers that changed everything. The criteria for ghetto designation reveal the clinical precision of Denmark's transformation. A neighborhood officially becomes a ghetto when more than 50% of residents are classified as non-Western immigrants and the area fails 2 additional benchmarks. Crime rates above the national average, more than 40% of adults without jobs or education, school test scores in the bottom tier nationally. These aren't subjective judgments or political opinions. They're mathematical thresholds that trigger government intervention. Once crossed, Danish authorities gain extraordinary powers. They can force residents to relocate. They can demolish public housing. They can double prison sentences for crimes committed within these designated zones. The numbers behind these decisions paint a stark picture. In some designated areas, unemployment reaches 60% among immigrant populations. Youth crime rates spike to 5 times the national average. School dropout rates hit 70% in certain districts. Educational test scores lag so far behind that Danish authorities concluded entire neighborhoods were failing to integrate into society. But the most shocking revelation came from Denmark's own integration data. Government studies found that third-generation immigrants in these areas were actually less integrated than their grandparents. Instead of gradual assimilation, Denmark was witnessing the creation of permanent parallel societies with their own economic systems, social hierarchies, and cultural norms that operated completely outside Danish law and customs. The financial burden became impossible to ignore. These neighborhoods consumed disproportionate welfare resources while contributing minimal tax revenue. The Danish welfare state, built on a delicate balance of high taxes and high trust, was hemorrhaging money into communities that weren't participating in the social contract. Prime Minister Frederiksen's 2018 New Year's speech captured the existential nature of the threat. She described immigrant neighborhoods as cancerous growths that were metastasizing throughout Danish society. Areas where Danish law didn't apply, where Danish values were rejected, and where Danish children couldn't safely attend school. The speech marked a turning point. Denmark's leadership had concluded that multicultural tolerance wasn't just failing, it was actively destroying the country they'd built. The welfare state that provided free healthcare, education, and generous benefits could only function in a high-trust, cohesive society. Parallel societies destroyed that trust and made the entire system unsustainable. This wasn't about culture wars or immigration philosophy. This was mathematical. Denmark's leaders looked at spreadsheets showing welfare expenditure, crime statistics, and integration metrics, then made a cold calculation. The existing approach was bankrupting the country while fracturing society into incompatible fragments. The Denmark without parallel societies plan became their roadmap to survival. Complete elimination of designated areas by 2030 through forced relocations, housing destruction, and what they euphemistically called transformation. The most progressive government in Europe had declared total war on multiculturalism. But declaring war was one thing. The weapons they chose revealed just how desperate Denmark had become, and just how far a liberal democracy will go when it believes its survival is at stake. Denmark's response came in 3 devastating waves. First, the ghetto plan itself. Authorities gained power to force residents out of designated areas and demolish up to 40% of public housing. The remaining units would be sold to private developers to attract middle-class Danish families. Residents who refused to relocate faced cutting off government benefits. The second wave targeted the justice system. Denmark passed laws doubling prison sentences for any crime committed in a designated parallel society. The same offence that earned 6 months in Copenhagen brought 12 months in a ghetto. Danish courts began operating under 2 separate legal systems based purely on geography and demographics. The third wave was the most radical. In 2021, Denmark's parliament voted 70-24 to authorize offshore detention centres for refugees and asylum seekers. Following Australia's model, Denmark planned to send refugees to processing facilities on African islands, ensuring they never set foot on Danish soil. The vote wasn't close. It wasn't controversial. 70 members of parliament, including the entire Social Democrat leadership, endorsed sending human beings to island prisons rather than allowing them into Danish society. But the crackdown didn't stop with housing and detention. Denmark banned face veils in public spaces, ended family reunification for refugees, and launched systematic surveillance of student visa holders. In September 2025, Integration Minister Rasmus Stoklund celebrated what he called a vicious witch hunt against Bangladeshi and Nepali students accused of visa abuse. The minister's language was telling. He wasn't apologizing for the harsh measures or expressing regret about their necessity. He was celebrating them. The Social Democrats had moved so far from their multicultural origins that they were publicly applauding the persecution of immigrant communities. Danish authorities began requiring immigrant children to attend mandatory classes on Danish values and democratic principles. Parents who refused faced prosecution. The government started separating immigrant children from their families for up to 25 hours per week to ensure proper cultural indoctrination. These weren't temporary emergency measures. They were permanent features of a new Danish model that prioritized social cohesion over individual rights, cultural uniformity over diversity, and collective survival over liberal idealism. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the policies themselves, but how quickly they became normalized. Danish media stopped questioning the morality of forced relocations. Danish citizens stopped debating the ethics of geographic-based sentencing. The transformation happened so smoothly that most Danes accepted their country's metamorphosis as natural and necessary. This normalization revealed something profound about liberal democracies under pressure. When faced with what they perceive as existential threats, even the most progressive societies will abandon their founding principles with shocking speed. The question wasn't whether Denmark had the right to protect itself. The question was what Denmark had become in the process, and perhaps most importantly, whether this transformation was uniquely Danish or represented something much more dangerous spreading across Europe. The normalization of these radical policies wasn't accidental. It revealed the most uncomfortable truth about Denmark's transformation. This wasn't imposed by extremists or foreign pressure. This was democracy in action. The Social Democrats didn't stumble into these policies. They calculated their way into them. Integration Minister Rasmus Stoklund made this calculation explicit. "There has been a huge change in perception over recent years on immigration," he told reporters in 2025. He wasn't describing a shift in government policy. He was describing a shift in public consciousness. Danish voters had reached the same mathematical conclusion as their leaders. The Social Democrats faced a simple political reality. They could either adopt the far right's immigration positions or watch the far right take power. So they made a choice that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. They stole the playbook of their political enemies and made it their own. But this wasn't mere political opportunism. The party's internal documents reveal a deeper strategic calculation. They recognized that Denmark's welfare state faced an impossible mathematical equation. Unlimited immigration plus unlimited benefits equals fiscal collapse. The numbers were undeniable. Something had to give. The strange driver behind Denmark's crackdown wasn't hatred or fear or cultural anxiety. It was arithmetic, cold, brutal arithmetic that forced even the most progressive politicians to choose between their ideological comfort and their country's survival. This arithmetic explains why the policies passed Parliament with such overwhelming margins. 70 to 24 wasn't a narrow victory won through political manipulation. It was a mathematical consensus reached by politicians who had seen the same data and drawn the same conclusions. The Social Democrats discovered what every welfare state eventually learns. High-trust societies with generous benefits can only function with shared values and mutual obligations. When significant portions of the population reject those values while claiming those benefits, the entire system breaks down. Denmark's leaders looked at neighborhoods where third-generation immigrants were less integrated than their grandparents and realized they weren't dealing with a temporary adjustment period. They were witnessing the permanent establishment of parallel societies that would never contribute to the Danish project. The crackdown wasn't driven by ideology. It was driven by the immune system of a welfare state defending itself against what it perceived as an existential pathogen. The Danish model couldn't survive the Danish multiculturalism experiment, so multiculturalism had to die. This explains why similar pressures are building across Europe. Every high-trust welfare state faces the same mathematical impossibility. Sweden's government now admits their immigration policies were unsustainable. Germany quietly suspended family reunification programs. Even traditionally, liberal governments are discovering the arithmetic of survival. The UK's Labour Party has begun studying the Danish model, despite facing fierce criticism from human rights groups. France's centrist government has implemented policies that would have been considered far-right extremism just 5 years ago. The Netherlands has moved toward mandatory integration programs that mirror Denmark's cultural indoctrination requirements. This isn't a coincidence. It's the same immune response spreading across European welfare states as they confront the same mathematical reality Denmark faced first. As of January 2026, Denmark's transformation remains a work in progress. The 2030 deadline for eliminating parallel societies is still 4 years away. The offshore detention centers are operational but underutilized. The forced relocations continue neighborhood by neighborhood, family by family. But the paradigm shift is complete. Denmark has proven that liberal democracies will abandon liberalism when they believe survival is at stake. They've demonstrated that welfare states have biological limits that can't be overcome through good intentions or moral arguments. The Danish model is spreading because it offers other European governments a politically viable solution to an impossible problem. It provides a framework for maintaining welfare state benefits while restricting access to those benefits. It shows how progressive parties can adopt restrictionist policies without losing their political identity. Human rights groups condemn the Danish approach as discriminatory and cruel. They're probably right. But their moral arguments crash against the mathematical reality that drove Denmark's transformation. The arithmetic that broke Danish multiculturalism is breaking multicultural movements across Europe. The most unsettling implication isn't what Denmark did to survive, it's how easily other countries are following the same path when faced with the same pressures. The Danish model isn't an aberration. It's a preview of what welfare states become when they choose survival over ideology. The structural pressures that transformed Denmark don't respect borders. They don't care about political parties or cultural traditions or historical commitments to human rights. They follow the same mathematical logic wherever high-trust societies encounter significant populations that reject their social contracts. This story isn't finished. Denmark's experiment won't be complete until 2030, and its long-term consequences remain unknown. But the immediate lesson is clear. Welfare states have limits, and when those limits are reached, even the most progressive societies will protect themselves through whatever means necessary. The Danish transformation reveals something profound about the future of European democracy. When forced to choose between ideological purity and institutional survival, survival wins. The question isn't whether this is right or wrong. The question is whether your country will face the same choice, and what it will choose when that moment comes. Stay subscribed to understand which countries are approaching their own mathematical breaking points, because the Danish model isn't staying in Denmark. These structural pressures are spreading, and recognizing them early might be the only way to avoid the same brutal transformation that turned the happiest country on earth into Europe's strictest gatekeeper.